Hi, I'm Miss Amber and I'm here with your English 12A live lesson. So today we're going to go over the seventh and last lesson from Unit 2 of English 12A. It's called Metaphysical Poets. And I'm just going to give you the warning now. It's a long lesson. So if you need to pause here and get yourself something to drink or get ready, this is going to be a long haul. So let me go ahead and get started sharing. All right, let me move myself up here as per usual. Okay, so we're gonna get started on slide 5 like usual. So they give you a bunch of historical background information first here in this slide. So they talk about the time period in which most of the metaphysical poets were born in or were born after. So they talk about the Renaissance and Elizabethan periods, and that basically marked a boom in British literature. So Queen Elizabeth I ruled for like 45 years, and she died in 1603. This is important because the climate that happened after she died is what everyone was living through at the time. So when she died, people were not sure about who would take the throne next and what that person would be like. So Elizabeth was a Protestant, which is a little closer to like standard Christianity, like we practice in the US now. But previously, before her, the country was known for being Catholic. So people who had converted or who were a part of the Protestant group were kind of on edge because usually when you have a new king or queen move in, they pass policies that affect how people live. So if it's been okay up until this point to live as a Protestant and you have a new king that passes laws that basically says either you can't be, it's illegal, or you'll be treated as a second class citizen if you're a part of this, that's a really big problem. So a monarch dying just like in the middle of what's considered to be a good age is a little rough for people. But the person who took the throne was King James VI of Scotland. And he changed his name to King James I of England and Ireland. So he was pretty much related to Henry the Seventh and Eighth through Margaret Tudor. So Margaret Tudor was the eldest daughter of King Henry the Seventh and sister to Henry the Eighth. So he was pretty much the only the first male in succession that was able to take up the position. So he did. You have to remember that at this time, people felt like the royal bloodlines were sacred and blessed by God. So whenever they were trying to find someone to fit the throne, it was important that they be related to other people who had been on the throne. That's why it was so important for monarchs to get married and have children. But Queen Elizabeth decided not to do that. So people didn't really know who would take the throne and if they would be radically different or not, pretty much. So him becoming King James, becoming the King of England, since he was previously from Scotland, he was able to unite those areas. So he decided to call himself the King of Great Britain. And when he did that, he was referring to England, Scotland, and Wales. So he pretty much went from being the King of Scotland to the King of Great Britain so that he wouldn't have to give up being in charge of Scotland either. The Scots and the English tend to have a tumultuous relationship historically. So him being king of both areas allowed them both an excuse to form and foster a friendly relationship. So the time that James was on the throne is known as the Jacobean period. They tell you this in the last paragraph of this slide. Jacobean comes from Jacobus, which is Latin for James. And the literature of the Jacobean period like the writing, isn't really that different from the Elizabethan period. Pretty much, if someone's referring to the Jacobean period for writing and the Elizabethan period in writing, they're mostly just trying to tell you who was in charge at the time. The writing was basically the same in both eras, so there's not a whole lot to distinguish between there. So in terms of how the Jacobean period actually turned out, a lot of people thought that he would slowly introduce like repeals the anti-Catholic laws, but he didn't do that at all. So he pretty much was like, yeah, no, I'm on, whatever that same stuff was that Elizabeth was on, I'm on that too. We're not trying to be Catholics here. People were afraid he was going to revert things back to Catholicism, but he did not. He actually disliked the Catholics a lot and persecuted them really aggressively, and that made people upset. Not necessarily just because they were religious, but because he was actively pursuing, like trying to get rid of them and push them out of the country and to make things hard for them. So that led to events in 1605. So pretty much in 1605, Catholic conspirators, so that means people who are like planning together, decided that they were going to try to blow up Parliament, which is the chamber that lawmakers in Britain like propose laws and debate things of the issues of the country in. They were going to blow up that location, and they were going to try to kill him. Now, this is the famous event that Guy Fawkes is associated with. Guy Fawkes is the person that basically represents, or that is represented by V from V for Vendetta, which is like a famous movie that most people know about. If you don't know about the V for Vendetta movie, all you really need to know is that Guy Fawkes was the person who was found in Parliament's basement in the cellar with the gunpowder that was supposed to blow it up. The reason why he wasn't successful is because one of the Catholic members of Parliament was sent a letter warning him to stay away, since the people who were planning this were Catholics themselves. They were just like, hey, don't show up. But he reported the letter. And so they searched Parliament and held off on having their usual meetings. So that whole event, all tied up in a bow, is called the Gunpowder Plot. And nobody really knows who sent the letter to that Catholic member. The Catholic guy's name is Lord Monteagle, but no one actually knows who sent that to him. And that's, like what's covered in this slide. Now, in the next slide, slide 7, they talk about some people who had issues with James. So it wasn't just the Catholics who had issues with James. So pretty much any extreme religious groups were also not very fond of King James. So the Puritans, who were like extreme Protestants. So we could definitely call Protestants something similar to the way that Christianity is practiced today. But the Puritans were, like I said, an extreme version of this. So the Puritans were the same group of people who were against like theater activity and plays. They wanted to push for the country to be very conservative. And they also wanted to change how the Church of England treated Catholics. They, on the other end, so basically Catholics were upset on one end, and on the other end, the Protestants were like, oh no, we need to be even meaner to the Catholics. And because King James was not pushing hard enough, they disliked him. Even though he struggled with these sort of issues while he was in charge, most people view his reign as successful, pretty much. And very specifically, this is important because things being successful allowed for arts and literature to thrive. And that's very important, just because this is the reason why we consider like the Jacobean and Elizabethan periods to be similar. There wasn't really a disruption in who could write what or who could do what. So there are other concepts that are explored here. We talk about the divine right principle, which is pretty much what I was talking to you about before. The divine right principle basically just says that monarchs or leaders are chosen by God. So they don't have to answer to anyone except God. And of course, as you can imagine, this is an issue because if kings and queens only have to answer to God, it means that if they're doing awful things to their people, that they don't ever answer for it, right? This belief pretty much came into conflict with another piece of law called the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta is a piece of paperwork that was made popular, passed, approved by the people in 1215. And it basically is the rule that says the king has to consult with Parliament when it comes to certain issues. And there's like a list of those issues in the document. So they include a couple examples here, raising taxes, for example. And King James was sort of at odds with the people in general. So it wasn't just the Catholics or the Puritans. He had a difficult time getting laws passed and things like that in some cases, because he had to rely on Parliament to pass laws or to give him the okay to pass certain laws. And this was partially because King James was also religious himself. He was a published author and he wrote religious poetry. Most of the poetry he wrote, though, was about how justified it was that he was in charge, pretty much. You'll also recognize King James if you have a King James Version Bible. He was the person to authorize that English translation, and it's the most used version of the Bible today. I feel like some of you were waiting to see if I was going to mention that, because the moment you hear King James, most people think of the King James Bible. Yes, he was the one who allowed that to be published. Okay. So the end of King James's reign was in 1625. That's the year that he died. And his second son is the person who took over for him. So the time period that he ruled in is called the Carolinian period. And even though Carolinian doesn't sound anything like Charles, the reason why they are related is because Carolus is the Latin word or the Latin equivalent of Charles. So it's just called the Carolinian period. Charles didn't have as good a reign as his father did. So like, even though King James had issues with certain groups, he was able to pretty much satisfy everyone enough to get some things done and to keep the kingdom stable. But Charles had a difficult time, partially because he married a Catholic woman. And he did this after becoming king. So because England was mostly Protestant, his decision wasn't popular. They were very concerned about if he was going to try to change the country back to being Catholic. And part of that issue spread to Parliament as well. Parliament didn't really trust him. They were worried he was going to try to pass laws that would make things easier for Catholics, even though they were trying to push them out of the country. And Charles also didn't trust Parliament, partially because of things that happened with his dad, King James, and partially because since they didn't trust him, he figured they were plotting against him, basically. But he had a worse relationship with Parliament than his dad did. So his dad did, King James did what he had to do to sort of keep things stable. But King Charles dissolved it in 1629. And this is after dismissing Parliament 3 times. Like, they met a few times and he was like, no, I don't want to hear anything you have to say. I'm not trying to listen to you. Everybody go home. And he did that 3 times between 1625 and 1629. Then in 1629, he was just like, you know what? I don't need this. He basically said, y'all are a bunch of haters and you're stopping me from doing what I have to do. So since a lot of the military is loyal to me, I'm just going to tell them to put y'all out because I need to do what I'm trying to do and you're not letting me. So he pretty much ruled alone by force for 11 years. And without Parliament approving of what he wanted to do, he was able to raise money to meet different costs that the government had. Like, you know, Parliament tries to look out for themselves and also the people sometimes. The point was for them to look out for the people of England, though. So if he tried to, for example, if Charles tried to pass high taxes or extra taxes or to raise the cost of things or just taking extra money for different stuff, Parliament would be like, why? For what? What are you doing? And you also have to remember that some of the things that a king can raise money for might put Parliament in danger. Charles already had a large military force, but there are some people who are loyal to Parliament. So if this ended up turning into a bigger conflict, it's entirely possible that Charles could just raise an army to deal with them. And we'll cover some of the ways that this happened and came into play in the next slides. Okay. So moving on to slide 10. It says here that unrest in Scotland forced Charles I to call for Parliament to meet, because there were just certain things to that he literally couldn't move forward in the country without Parliament's approval. Because if Parliament doesn't meet to approve things, most of the time the people just won't do what you're asking them to do. There are some things that he can do, like he can definitely appeal to the people and say, like, listen, the government needs money, so we're just going to do this. If he doesn't make his demands like too unreasonable, people will comply. But when it comes to trying to, for example, declare war, or try to deal with, for example, the unrest in Scotland that has to do with battling and resources, if he needs any more resources to deal with that than he already has, he has to call in Parliament to get the people's approval to do more. It's one of those things where you want to avoid or try to avoid having a civil war on your hands, because if you have two people on different sides in your country who are arguing about whether or not the king has the right to do something, or if the king is asking the people to do the right thing, that's how you get a lot of infighting. So when he called Parliament to deal with Scotland, the people who were in Parliament at the time just said no. They were just like, no, you want too much. They felt like he was trying to make another set of grabs to solidify power. And he dismissed them after meeting for a month. He was just like, y'all are not helping me get what I want done, so you have to go. But later, there was rebellion in Ireland, and that forced him to call things again because he needed a new army to help replace some people who were lost from the incursion with Scotland and some other things. Parliament was just like, no, we're not even going to meet. This time, Parliament refused to meet with him because they were worried that the king would use whatever army he had left to try to force them to agree with what he wanted. So they just didn't even meet to try to give him permission. And this makes things rough because when people in your kingdom know that the people who represent them won't even meet to support you, that tells them that they shouldn't support you. So this made things a lot more difficult for Charles. And then that didn't help at all because the King Charles's response was to arrest or try to arrest some of the people who were holding back the most. So like the people who were loudest about not helping him, about not wanting to meet, he tried to have them arrested so that the people who were left would be intimidated into doing what he wanted. But when he tried to do that and the English people saw what he was doing, that's how we actually got another rebellion. And the rebellion, not only did it force the king to leave, so the kingdom was in chaos for a while, but it actually did kick off a civil war, which is exactly the sort of thing that he was trying to avoid by just dismissing Parliament altogether, right? So in 1642 is when the English Civil War began. There was a period in the middle in 1646 when the fighting stopped temporarily, and King James gave himself up to the Scottish army. Pretty much, he gave himself up because he was hiding out with his family, and he figured that they would be safer to be with the Scottish than the English, since he was, you know, beefing with Parliament pretty much. But they pretty much turned him over to English Parliament, and he had to escape. So he escaped to an island called the Isle of Wight. And basically, since he's the son of a man who was originally the King of Scotland, he was able to convince Scotsmen to invade England. And so all the fighting started all over again in 1648. So because he convinced the Scotsmen to invade England, that was considered treason. Because I mean, he was technically king over all of Great Britain, which includes Scotland. So he pretty much conspired to have part of Great Britain fight another part of Great Britain, and that is considered treason. So he was found guilty and he was executed. And then after this, a man called Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, started to come to power. And because he was a Puritan, remember that's the extreme religious sect within the Protestants, that changed British society a lot. Cromwell didn't want to be called a king or anything that had to do with royalty. He took on the title Lord Protector. And the time period where he was mostly in charge, I mean, he wasn't in charge per se, but he had power at the time. It's known as the Protectorate period. Okay, why is all of this important? The reason why this is important is because the metaphysical poets are all poets that existed during all of these times. What makes them related to each other, basically, is the type of things that they wrote, not necessarily when they were born and when they operated. So there are some metaphysical poets who never met each other and were unfamiliar with how their work influenced other people at all. And since this is such a wide period of time, we can't really call these poets like a movement or anything like that, because usually a movement is something that's done on purpose with the intention or purpose of getting to a goal. So for example, the Harlem Renaissance, the goal of the Harlem Renaissance as a movement was to try to put the Black experience into artwork that could be understood by people regardless of color, but still keep the soul of Black people in Harlem and across the nation at the time, for example. There's other movements like the beat poetry movement, the realism movement and things like that. But these were all authors who were born within the same time, so they were influenced by the same things. The metaphysical poets are a group of poets who wrote about the same things somehow, even though they weren't really related to each other. So the easiest way to learn about the metaphysical poems, like what metaphysical poetry is about, is to just sort of read and learn about the traits of the poetry and worry a little less about how all of the authors are connected to each other. So normally in these lessons, they'll tell you, oh, well, these authors were inspired by these authors who knew these authors. And there is a little bit of that, but most of it is that these poets are not born in the same time period. So some of them didn't meet each other. So to get into what a metaphysical poem actually is. So it's pretty much based on the word metaphysical. And metaphysical is something that's beyond the physical. So things that you can't really perceive or sense with like your five senses. None of the metaphysical poets, it says they did not know each other, nor did they think of themselves as belonging to a literary movement. And there's even a case later on where a poet Further down the timeline in 1779, used metaphysical poets as an insult. So they give you a list of a couple of things that's part of the poetry here in this, and they do it through the criticism of Samuel Johnson. So it says, he felt that the work of these poets was overly abstract. So that tells you that metaphysical poems are abstract, right? So abstract means that it's not a concrete idea. They write about things that don't have like a physical form, like love or fear or the divine, right? Things that don't actually have like a physical form for you to perceive. They wrote about those kind of things. And it says he also believed that their pervasive means to use a lot, you can find it a lot, of wit and their tendency to juxtapose contrasting ideas for effect, sacrifice concern for the sound of poetry. So there's a couple things we can get out of this sentence. There's pervasive use of wit. So we know what wit is. It's like punchlines, right? You were able to incorporate, like small Easter eggs of intelligent references and punchlines into your work. So they used a lot of that. And your tendency to juxtapose contrasting ideas. So when you juxtapose things, when two things are juxtaposed, this is what you should think of. So you have two things from the opposite ends of a spectrum that are being compared to each other for effect. So if you compare two things that aren't alike, that makes people think harder about what those two things could have in common to be compared. And this is one of the things that metaphysical poems did. I'm sure that they'll list it on the next slide. But yep, they would take ideas that don't seem like they go together and actually compare them. And this guy, Samuel Johnson, just didn't like that. But through his criticism, we can see what some of the traits of them are. Okay. So slide number 13 is called Carpe Diem. I'm sure that some people are familiar with this phrase. It means seize the day, right? Make the most of today. And it was one of the concepts that was becoming popular through the time that the metaphysical poets were existing. So not all of them were inspired by it, but it was one of those ideas that were hovering in the background of works at the time. And one of the things that the metaphysical poets have in common is that each of them were inspired by this specific thing. So let's just go over the slide because I think that'll help make it a little clearer. So it says here, the metaphysical poets had a common interest in looking at the world in new ways. They incorporated, so that means that they mixed in scientific imagery into their poems, even their love poems. So they basically talked about scientific things and used those things to describe pretty much all of their concepts in poetry. And it says their poetry is often called think feel poetry. Readers have to read metaphysical poems carefully, think about the imagery and metaphors, and then feel the impact of the words. So what they're trying to say here is that metaphysical poems are types that seem crazy and silly when someone gives you the summary or when you start to read what it's about. But if you take time to think about the comparison that's being made, it'll make more and more sense. So it's not upfront. You have to actually read in between the lines and dig deep. And that's why this is such a long tutorial. There's actually quite a bit in here to go over, because it's important to sort of understand how to peel back the layers to try to get and understand a metaphysical poem. So because they were interested in looking at the world in new ways, they also focus on new themes, and they give you the comparison. So before the metaphysical poets started writing works, most of the themes were bleak, dark themes that were popular in the Middle Ages. That's what was popular in the Elizabethan period. They've mentioned memento mori here. Now, memento mori is a phrase in Latin that means remember death. And the reason why this was popular, was partially because of the religious influence that existed at the time. Memento Mori, remember death, pushed people to focus their thoughts on how much better the afterlife would be than the world that they were in. Shape your behavior to get into heaven so that you can have a good time after you're gone. Even if these times are bad, things will be better when you die, pretty much. And because a lot of the country was religious at the time, Catholics were in charge during the Middle Ages, but even during the Elizabethan period, it was just a different type of religion. It wasn't Catholicism, but it was Protestant. Both are a type of Christianity, though. So if you've seen people who, you know, like try to focus on what their good behavior and things will do for them after they die, that's where it comes from. It comes from the Memento Mori themes from the Middle Ages. But in the early 17th century, people started to focus on the Carpe Diem, seize the day, live for today type of thinking. And just as a reminder, side note, the trick for centuries, when people give you numbers like these, I've mentioned this in other videos, but I'm hoping if I continue to do it, people will remember. 17th century, subtract 1, and then add double zeros. And that tells you what time period we're talking about. So this says 17th century, subtract 1, that's 16, and add double zero. So the 17th century is just the 1600s. So this is the period where Carpe Diem, seize the day, became more popular. And metaphysical poetry focused on Carpe Diem instead of Memento Mori. Okay. So this next slide, number 14, talks about use of sound. So basically what they want to do is compare smoother sounding poetic language to harsher sounds. So they do this by giving you an excerpt of something smooth, and then they're going to show you what the metaphysical poets did. So this first excerpt is from Edmund Spenser, and he was an Elizabethan age poet, like a typical poet. He was just a normal poet doing what was popular at the time. So he used pleasant sounding words, also known as euphonious words. So this excerpt from Spenser's Sonnet 54 is an example of that, and I'll go ahead and read it out. But when I laugh, she mocks, and when I cry, she laughs and hardens evermore her heart. What then can move her, if nor mirth nor moan, she is no woman but a senseless stone? So what this is here is a lot of S sounds and M sounds and O sounds, and those are considered soft sounds. There's a very big difference between S and F and and O sounds, as opposed to something harsh like a B or like a K, or even something like Z for Z or X, right? Even X itself is a harsh sound. The way that your mouth curls when you make it makes it a harsh sound. We think of harsh sounds when we hear X, right? So on the next slide, they give you an example of one of the metaphysical poets. It's John Donne. And this is from a poem called Valediction Forbidding Morning. So I'm going to read that as well. If they be two, they two are so as stiff twain compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. So there are a lot of harsh sounds here. There's T's, T, P's, P. There's F. The sounds are usually not as harsh, but sometimes they can be. It depends on what word you're saying. In this case, we have fixed. So because of the word fixed, the fact that there's an X and a D there at the end, it makes it sound harsher. So the T, P, F, and D sounds are jarring to the ear. So even just reading a couple of these lines back to back, right? Just the first lines. But when I laugh, she mocks, and when I cry, compared to if they be two, they are to so, right? So we have a lot of T's in there, B's in there, F's in there. It's a different type of sound. So metaphysical poets liked those sort of harsh sounds. And John Donne specifically is described as having a rough style because he uses those sort of words. So when authors and poets use these kind of words in their poetry, you have to remember that they chose every single word that they put in there. There are other ways that they could have phrased what they have in here, but they thought about how it sounded to the person who would be reading it out loud. And because they thought so hard about that, it's not just, oh, why did these, like old people write this way? Couldn't they just write it in plain English? Like, yes, they could. Even plain English for the time that they were writing in would be different than the poems they published. But they wanted the sounds to give you a specific feeling when you were reading them, and their audiences a specific feeling when they were reading them. And that's why they chose those words. Whenever you're reading a professional poem by someone who claims to do it for a living, or a historical figure that you know was a professional poet, you should always be thinking that they chose these words on purpose. I know that it's hard with a lot of these because you have to study them and they're difficult to understand sometimes. But try to remember that they were chosen specifically to sound and feel the way that they do. Now down here at the bottom, it says here the metaphysical poets also broke away from tradition by using robust and colloquial language. So colloquial just means local language. So the type of language, words, and accents that people speak in the area that you are in. So similarly to how people in different areas of Michigan speak a little differently. They use a couple words that are different. Maybe their sentence order is different. Maybe they have standard phrases that they use in situations that happen like up north that we don't get, like in Southeast Michigan, like in Detroit, or Western Michigan, because people's lives are different across different areas of the state. So the metaphysical poets used everyday language for the area that they were in instead of like high fancy language like in traditional poetry. So they give you an example of this. It's a poem, Lines from the Collar by George Herbert. So it says here, I struck the board and cried, no more, I will abroad. What? Shall I ever sigh and pine? My lines and life are free, free as the road. So the fact that he just says no more, I will abroad, he basically is like, I'm gonna leave. And that's not the way that a person would normally say that they would leave in formal poetry. But because that's the phrases that people use every day, that's what he put in his poem. He wanted people to understand that this was at least being told from the perspective of an everyday person. Okay. So now we're into slide 16, conceits and imagery. So they pretty much explain what conceits and imagery are. And I'm gonna try to cut through some of the fat here in this slide to get you just the information you need. So a conceit is a metaphor. So remember, a metaphor is a comparison between two things that does not use like or as. So it's a metaphor that compares two unexpected things. So remember, we talked about how the metaphysical poets like to juxtapose contrasting themes. That's exactly what this is. They use conceits. And just to go over it again a little more slowly, a conceit is a metaphor that compares two unexpected things. And the reason why they use this is because it creates a shocking opening. So the idea of their openings, using a conceit in the opening, was to make you think, what? Why are you comparing? These aren't alike. And then you look closer to the poem and you're like, oh, okay. So they said these two things are alike. You're gonna have to prove it. Let me read the rest of the poem. That was kind of the point of it. And it's considered a staple of metaphysical poetry. It's one of those things that all of those poems have in common. And they use an example in George Herbert's Praise number 3. He compares God's generosity to a bottle. And they seem so unrelated that there's no point in comparing them. And that's what makes it a conceit. So then he spends the rest of the poem explaining in like image, like with imagery and sensory language, how those two things are alike. And conceits also play into the idea of think and feel poetry, is what this slide says. Just because since you don't understand why the two things are being compared, you have to read the whole poem to understand what they have in common. So you can't just get the meaning just from looking at the title or looking at the first line. You won't understand what they're talking about until you read the whole thing all the way through. So that's how it relates to think and feel poetry. Let's see. Oh, and they go over the idea of scientific imagery here. So it says, for instance, instead of comparing one's love to a rose, a metaphysical poet would choose something more scientific and unexpected, like a compass or a star. Okay, so this slide, number 17, has 3 other literary devices here. So they're paradoxes, hyperbole, and synecdoche, those 3 things. So we're gonna go over each one and talk about why they are important. So just as a note, there is a list here at the beginning of the paragraph. It says puns, verbal wit, paradoxes, hyperbole, and synecdoche all make metaphysical poems especially interesting to read. So we know what puns are. Puns are when you make a joke based on a play on words, just in case you didn't know. So for example, let's see, what sort of pun do I want to use? Something like, that is my favorite deer. I can't wait to have it for dinner, right? So we have a punchline here. Deer can be a person who is dear to you. Deer can also be literally a deer, the actual animal. So puns make jokes based on words that sound the same but have different meanings. Verbal wit is just being able to hit with those quippy punchlines, being able to say smart things in short form. And the other 3 are what we're going to go over with the next couple slides. So they give you the definition for a paradox. It's a statement that seems to explore a possible truth, but when you look more closely at it, it doesn't make sense or is contradicting itself. So they give you examples of this. The example is a lawyer saying, truthfully, all lawyers are liars. So most people would agree that lawyers are liars because they get paid to try to fight for the innocence of whoever it is they're representing, even if the person actually is guilty, right? But the fact that a lawyer is saying that to you means that the lawyer is also a liar. So you can't trust him saying that all lawyers are liars, even though he's a lawyer, because he's a lawyer. So that's an example of a paradox. It seems like it's true. Yeah, most people would agree lawyers are liars, right? But if the lawyer is a liar and he's telling you that, then maybe it's not true. So this is the contradictory thing that's happening here, or the illogical thing that's happening. The next slide goes over hyperbole and synecdoche. So we'll take them on one at a time. Hyperbole is when you use an exaggeration to be funny. And I mean, they give you an example here from a poem called To His Coy Mistress. And I'll go over this example in just a second. But if you've ever, for example, said, yeah, I don't want just a slice of cake, give me that whole cake, right? You're saying that you can eat the whole cake. You probably couldn't, right? But you're basically saying you don't want just one slice because you're hungry. So you're exaggerating. So that's like a very small, casual example of a hyperbole. But in poetry, people use exaggeration all the time because you're trying to build up big images in people's heads about what you're talking about. So let me read the formal example that they give you here. This is from To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell. It says, 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest, an age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. So he's stating that he would need 100 years to properly admire his lover's eyes, 200 for each breast, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, it's not going to take that long for him to admire her. There's not that much of her for all of that. But by exaggerating with this hyperbole, he's showing like how much he adores her. He would want to linger that long on every part of her because he loves her that much. So think of exaggeration when you hear the word hyperbole. Now, this second one is slightly more complicated, but I think that we can tackle it. So that fancy word right here, as you've heard me say a couple times, is synecdoche. Synecdoche. So that CHE at the end is pronounced like key, like a K. That CH is pronounced like a K. Synecdoche. So the definition of synecdoche is when you write about or refer to a part of an object to represent the whole thing, or the whole thing to represent a part. So for example, a common example is a block, right? So a city block is usually like an entire area encompassing a couple, like quite a few streets that are interconnected in a space and the buildings that are in the middle of that space, right? But when most people are at home in front of their house, they refer to the street that they live on as a block. It's not actually a block, that's just a street. A street helps make up part of a block. But people refer to their street as a block all the time. Oh, I'm about to hop around the block real quick, that kind of thing. So you're using the idea of the whole block to just refer to your street. And because other people understand what you're saying, there's not an issue. This also happens in poetry too. And they give you an example here from John Donne's Sonnet 10. And it says, as soonest our best men will go, with thee to go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. So he's talking about best men. Best men is like soldiers. So usually when you hear the phrase best men, you think like your best fighting men in like a village or a town or in like a regiment of soldiers. So when he says rest their bones and soul's delivery, he's talking about the ones who have died in battle. Basically, as soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. So they're saying these bones are basically the dead bodies of the best men who went with this person. And because they're using the word bone, I'm sorry, I got muted there for a second. Because he's using the word bones to represent a dead body, and it says with thee do go in the first line, you can assume that he's talking about someone who has already passed away and the people who died with them. So he's using bones, which is only a part of a body, to represent a dead body. Because usually when a body decays, what's left? You have the bones. Okay, we are more than halfway through the lesson, so we can do it. So in this lesson, this middle chunk here, we get 3 metaphysical poets. And we're going to go over some examples of metaphysical poetry they're going to give you to read. And then we'll do some analysis stuff. But for the most part, you guys have already gotten most of the information of what metaphysical poems are like. So most of the explanations you're going to get about the reading will just be connecting the ideas we went over already to what you're reading. All right, so let's jump into it. The first poem and poet is John Donne, and we're going to be looking at his poet, The Flute. So they give you some information about him to start with. and I'll go over the major bits. So he was born into a Roman Catholic family in 1572. He served as a court preacher and a dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. So he was kind of heavy into the church life. And he did this during a time where England was extremely anti-Catholic, as we explained earlier. People were afraid of the Catholics being back in power in England. He was not famous during his lifetime, and most of his works were about him contemplating or thinking about his own mortality, the fact that he was going to die, he had a short life. And he was so into this idea that he preached his own funeral sermon weeks before he actually died. He's known for emphasizing research, for using metaphors, and for dramatic wit. So yes, he was clearly very smart, but he made things sort of like drawn out and dramatic in his work. And what makes him a metaphysical poet is basically the way that he uses imagery and symbolism and metaphors in his poems. Remember, none of these metaphysical poets were born at the same time or knew each other. So they have the sort of themes of like conflicting ideas, the scientific imagery. They came up with all of this all on their own during the long stretch of this time period. It says here, his love poems often included religious imagery, while his religious poems often included sexual imagery. So he wanted people to understand the comparisons between how people can feel about love and religion, and how that devotion is not always, but sometimes interchangeable. Okay, so here in this slide, slide 22, we get a little more information about his poem that we're reading, The Flea. So this poem exhibits a lot of the characteristics for metaphysical poetry, and they're going to go over this. One of the things is that it's a monologue. So it's for one person, it's just sort of talking to an audience. But this is addressed to the speaker's crush or beloved, as it says here. But the title is unusual for a love poem because like people don't think of fleas when they think of things that are lovely and attractive. So this is like a classic example of think feel poetry. You're like, it's a love poem and it's called The Flea. How? Why? And the idea is you would have to read the poem to see. So he uses a conceit. That's the metaphor comparing two things that are not alike, that lasts the entire poem. And he compares a flea to a marriage bed. So the marriage bed is basically just, you know, like a bed that a married couple has like relations in, right? So you have to read the entire poem to understand why he's comparing this sort of pest animal to the marriage bed. And they explain that there's a couple other things to understand about the culture at the time too. So they give you some background on this. It says here, to fully understand the poem, one must understand common Renaissance beliefs about sex. Blood was seen as a life force. Additionally, it was commonly believed that people exchanged blood during intercourse. So that means that many people believe that every time a person engaged in intercourse, he or she would lose a bit of life. And part of this was, you know, the church trying to control like what people did. But part of this also just had to do with the culture of what was popular at the time. So just as a summary, in case, you know, that was a little too much, blood was seen as a life force and people thought that you exchanged blood during intercourse. And more importantly, they felt like you would lose a little bit of your life every time you had sex. So you had to be careful about who you had sex with. So let me go on to explain how he uses this in the poem. He uses these beliefs in the poem to try to convince the person that he loves to go to bed with him, even though they're not married. So what he does in this poem is points out that a flea has already mixed their blood when it bit both of them, because fleas were like very common for people during this day and age at this time. They didn't really have like insulated housing the same way that they do now. There wasn't a whole lot of like hygienic practices with the technology in terms of how people like ate and lived and bathed at the time. So fleas were fairly common. And because a lot of livestock were in the same areas that people were in all the time, it was almost impossible to avoid fleas pretty much. So his logic is, I'm pretty sure that while we've been in the same place, a flea has bitten you and me at the same time. So technically, our blood's already been mixed with each other. So we might as well like do the do, since in a religious sense, the thing that they were trying to avoid has probably already happened. So this whole poem was basically just him just trying to convince the woman he liked to have sex with him without marrying her. And this also zones in on the Carpe Diem message, because he's basically arguing, hey, we shouldn't plan ahead for when we're going to get married. Life is going by fast and we don't know what tomorrow will bring or if we'll be together tomorrow or even be alive tomorrow. So we should definitely have sex now. Just ridiculous. But this is a formal poem. On the bottom of this slide, they tell you about the structure of it. The rhyme scheme is set up in couplets. So that means that each, like, so pairs of lines, every 2 lines have the same kind of rhyme. And the exception is that the last 3 lines are their own stanza. So he breaks off the last 3 lines away from the rest of the poem. And those 3 lines rhyme with each other and are offset in alignment of the poem. So basically, there's physical space. There's a space between the bulk of the poem and these 3 lines at the bottom. And they also don't rhyme with the rest of the poem. And it says, as you read the poem, think about what the purpose of this structural decision might have been. So why did he think to pull these 3 lines away? When you read it, they want you to make a guess as to why he might have done that. Okay, so as you all know, I don't go over the reading selections. So you can take a moment to pause this video, click on the reading selection to open it up, and meet me back on the next slide whenever you're ready. If you're the type of student that wants to hear what analysis they have before anything else, this is pretty much the analysis. They're pretty much giving it to you before you read it, because there's so much information involved. So at this point, you pretty much know everything there is to know about the poem, what it's about, what he's trying to do. So just go ahead and read. Okay, so we have a second poem by John Donne that we're going to be looking at here on slide 24. We get an explanation of it. I think we actually looked through 3 poems of his. So there's one more after this one, especially because these poems are short. So they're throwing quite a few at you. So this poem is called The Sun Rising, and it's not as explicit. So it's not as sexual as The Flea. And the important thing to know about this poem is that it's an example of literary apostrophe. And an apostrophe is when the speaker calls upon or addresses someone who doesn't respond. So basically, the poem is directed at someone who is not actually in the poem with real lines. So usually those so think of like someone giving a speech, right? Sometimes when people write speeches, they write them to people who are no longer here or to people who are not in their life anymore. So think of this poem as something like that. Usually these poems kind of ask questions about why certain things have happened, why things are the way they are. And usually they're associated with deep emotional expression. So basically, if you've ever seen like the sort of like movie where someone has to get their life together and figure themselves out, you usually end up with a scene near the end where they sort of give a speech to no one about themselves and the journey that they've been on, and trying to figure like the path that they've taken to try to figure out how to deal with their situation and make something good out of it. These poems, these literary apostrophes, are basically that, but in a poem. So keep that in mind while you're reading this poem and think about who they might be addressing this to. Other things that you might want to keep in mind, it says here that the sun rising expresses romantic sentiment. So that means romantic feelings, but in a non-sentimental manner. So what they're trying to say here is he references romantic things, but this poem is actually about religion. So it's not meant in like a lovey-dovey sort of way. And then it says like many metaphysical poems, it includes scientific and geographical imagery. So geographical means basically locations around the world. It has information about the earth, the places and things like that. It says it also uses reverse syntax. And that just means that the word order that you would normally expect is reversed in this poem. So they're telling you up front to expect the sentences to read kind of backwards so you can adjust to it. And it says at the same time, Don's witty puns keep the overall tone light and playful. So you know that puns are the plays on words that sound alike but mean different things. So keep that in mind while you're reading this poem as well. Again, this is a short poem. And they pretty much told you everything about this up front. So there's not really gonna be an analysis to follow here. We're just gonna go straight into the next poem. So if you need to pause while you're reading The Sun Rising, go ahead and do that and meet me at the next slide. Okay, this is the last one from John Donne. They let you know that he also wrote sonnets. So that's what we're gonna be reading on this slide. We're reading one of his sonnets. 19 of them were published together as the Holy Sonnets many years after his death in 1631. So this is one of the more famous ones, and it opens with "Death, be not proud." And this line is quoted a lot. So if you are one of the rare people who have ever heard it, this is where it comes from. This sonnet is also an apostrophe. So remember, this is someone speaking to a person that's unaddressed that doesn't make an appearance in the poem. In this case, they do tell you who he's talking to because he makes it obvious. Donne is speaking directly to death personified. So he's talking to death as if death is a person. So he pretty much tells death that it's not as powerful as it thinks. This has the characteristics of a traditional Italian sonnet. So I'm gonna read the definition of that and then break that down for you. It says it has an octave that represents the problem and a sestet that answers the problem. So they pretty much tell you what these groups are, but I'm just going to break down octave and sestet just in case anyone's not following along. An octave is a stanza or like a paragraph in a poem that has 8 lines. And a sestet is a paragraph or stanza in a poem that has 6 lines. So there's the first 8 lines that represents a problem, and the next 6 lines that answers that problem. It says the rhyme scheme in the octave is traditional. So I believe that that's couplets. And it says, but the sestet, so that's the set of 6 lines towards the end, rhyme scheme deviates from the Italian form and it ends in a couplet. So those are 2 separate things. The sestet, the group of 6, deviates from the Italian form. So they change the rhyme scheme. And then as a separate fact, it ends in a couplet. So take a moment to read Sonnet 10. They pretty much gave you the summary of it here. He's talking to death. He's telling death that death isn't as powerful as it thinks it is. That's pretty much all that there is to this sonnet. So go ahead and take a moment to pause and read the sonnet. And you can meet me back at slide 27 after you answer a question for George Herbert, who is the next metaphysical author. Okay, here we are at slide 27. This is George Herbert. We had an excerpt from one of his poems early on, but now we're going to learn a little more about him. So he was born 2 whole decades after John Donne. He was born to a wealthy Welsh family. So he was a completely different area than John Donne. He was very religious and served in Parliament before becoming an Anglican priest. So Anglican in this case just means part of the Anglican people. He was an English priest, basically. but he struggled with his relationship with God, even though he was very religious. And it says here his poems suggest that he viewed his relationship with God as a friendship, but one that's burdened with difficulty. Many of Herbert's poems discuss the balance of power between humans and God, probably because he struggled with that a lot. And he expressed a lot of frustration with the power that God has over him. So he's known for using biblical metaphors, imagery, and conceits. Remember, that's when you're comparing two things that are not alike to express those feelings of frustration. And as a Christian poet, he both praises and challenges God, but in the end, he accepts that God has a final authority. So most of his poems are about that struggle. So the poem that we're going over for him, there's only one. It's called The Collar, which we can already tell where we're going with that, since we know that he had a difficult time with accepting how much power God had over him. So this pretty much reflects his difficulties with feeling controlled. He basically tells the audience, the person reading in this poem, about a situation where he decided to go against God because he was so frustrated. Because this is a metaphysical poem, trying to remember that this is going to contain like everyday, normal, plain speech for the time. So it's not going to be anything that you guys are used to, but just keep in mind that this is what people every day on the street, sort of would hear if they were talking to people. It has normal, plain speech from this time period. So Herbert's poems are more serious than Don's, but there is still a pun here. So if you didn't pick it up, the title of the poem talks about both the collar that's worn by priests and also the term collar, which means anger. You can also say that it reflects the sort of restrictiveness of, like the priest collar and how tight it is on your neck, right? So this is definitely like an emotional look at one man's struggle with religion and freedom, as it says here. That's definitely what this is. So take a couple moments to read this, and you can meet me over on slide 30 after answering a question, and we'll get to the last author. We're almost there. Okay, so here we are at slide 30. We only have 6 slides left. This is the last author we're dealing with for this lesson. So if you made it this far, congratulations. Hang in there with me just a little bit longer. We're near the end of the lesson. So this author's name is Andrew Marvell. He was born into the Anglican Church, so like the Church of England. It says he dabbled in Catholicism, so he tried out Catholicism a little, being a Catholic a little bit. But for the most part, he aligned himself with whatever religion was in favor at the time. So remember that when Queen Elizabeth died, people weren't sure if the rules were going to go back and forth. And then, so King James was very anti-Catholic. But remember, his son, King Charles, married a Catholic woman. So at certain points, being a Catholic was worse than others. So he pretty much aligned himself with whatever group would cause him the least amount of grief. It says that some of his contemporaries, that means people who were alive during his time, criticized him for his flexibility. So basically, they felt like he was being opportunistic by going back and forth on religion, even though more than likely, he probably just wanted to be safe and explore his views. And it does say that some of his political views also changed over time. So some of his earlier poems align him with the royal family that was in charge at the time. But after 1649, many of his poems praise Oliver Cromwell, who the Lord Protector, who took over after King Charles was executed. So it says, as Cromwell fell out of favor, Marvell's poems began to welcome the return of a royal monarch. So although his contemporaries viewed him as an opportunist, Many scholars today see Marvel as an early supporter of religious tolerance and political freedom. So they're saying that looking back on his poems, it's entirely possible that he just recognized that some people change religions over the point of their life, not just based on what's going on, but based on what makes sense to them, especially because he openly believed that more than one religion could exist in the same country. And that was not something that people thought at the time. Like, a lot of people take this for granted, especially because we're in the United States, but in most countries, unless they've had like an extensive history with the Christian religion, most countries try to have just one major religion. Even the US allows people to practice more than in other countries, but we still have Christianity as the major religion here. There are definitely a lot of countries that just don't even push for religious tolerance at all. It's the culture's way or the highway. And that can be difficult if you're in a place where the culture changes with who is in charge. And that's basically the issue that people were having, for example, when Queen Elizabeth took the throne and pushed out the Catholics. When she died and left the throne open, the citizens of Britain were just like, well, we're used to this one way of life, or this is what we actually believe. And if someone, just like shows up and suddenly tries to change things, that's going to be a problem, because our religion is not just what's being taught to us, it's also what we're used to and how we live. So that's an issue that people had at the time. And Andrew Marvel thought that it's possible for multiple religions to exist without, like hurting each other or competing. Let's see, slide 31. Okay, so Andrew wrote less poetry than Don or Herbert. He was known mostly for prose. It says here political and satirical. So political, we know what that means, but satirical means to criticize. So basically to sort of expose the flaws of. And prose is just not poetry. So if you're writing a story, an article, all of those things count as prose. Anything that is not a poem is prose. So he wrote more stories, articles, and essays than he did poems. He's best known for his poems, though, because they include metaphysical and neoclassical traits. So neoclassical is pretty much writing that's similar to what the colonists were writing in America. So there were a lot of scientific, logical things instead of religious imagery. And the metaphysical stuff tells you basically all the stuff that we've learned. So we've got the wit, the conceits, comparing things that are not alike. And then it says, in many ways, Marvel's writing is very similar to Don's. Both use paradox, complex tone, dramatic monologue, wit, and logic to express truth. But then they give you a couple more facts. On the other hand, Marvel's elegant, well-crafted, and concise means in short form, style is similar to that of Ben Jonson, who was one of the first neoclassical poets. So he basically grabbed stuff and inspiration from a bunch of different styles. He has some traits that are similar to Don, and he has some traits that are similar to this Ben Jonson neoclassical poet. And it says, despite similarities between Marvel and Jonson, Marvel is mainly considered a metaphysical poet. So like the things that he has in common with the other metaphysical poets put him in that category instead of in the neoclassical category. So basically a bunch of people took a look at his writing and said like, well, does he have more traits from this category or this category? And they decided that he was going to fit best in the metaphysical poetry section. Okay. It says here, To His Coy Mistress is highly reflective of Marvel's work. It's the best known Carpe Diem poem, remember that seize the day, of the 17th century. And it's both a love poem and a logical argument. So that's that neoclassical section mixed with the metaphysical section. It says, we can trace the logic of his argument through words such as if, then, however, and therefore. So he's basically making like a layered debate style argument. And it says the speaker of the poem, the basic premise is that if he had all the time in the world, then he would spend it with his love, which is the person that the poem is addressed to. It says, however, he does not have all the time in the world. Therefore, he pleads with her not to waste time. So pretty much, because he's making a logical argument about not wasting time because they don't have time, but he would spend the time if he had it, it's hard to tell if Marvel as a writer supports or is criticizing the speaker in the poem's view on passion. So some people think that he's like exposing or being satirical about people who use logic and reasoning too much when it comes to love. But others look at the poem and just see it as blending logic and love to make an argument for how it should be expressed with intent, like on purpose, without wasting time. And it explores the dichotomy. So that means like the coexistence, two things that seem like they don't go together, but can exist together, between desiring this person physically and spiritual longing that you get by joining together with someone. And there's not really anything else to go over. There's not really any analysis for this either. So just pause the video right here and take a moment to read To His Coy Mistress, and then meet me back at the next slide. Oh, wait. Nope. Hang on. Okay. So for the focus on language, there pretty much is just a lesson activity. They pretty much want you to read lines from the poems that you've looked at today and be able to answer questions on them. Pretty much, they just want you to be able to figure out what sections of the poem add to the impact that they've explained. So in these slides, they've given you a lot of information about the effects that these sections of the poems have on people who are reading. So they want you to be able to break that down and actually point out which lines are a part of that. So make sure that you read the instructions carefully, and I don't think that this will be a problem. I think that that's it for this lesson as well. Yeah. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, so the metaphysical poets are a little difficult to understand at first. It seems like a lot, but when they break it down in small form, I would just take it little by little. This lesson was long. I think if you had difficulty understanding it, you should definitely schedule tutoring, but also make sure that you just take time to rewind the video, go back to certain parts, and make sure that you're taking notes, because they give you a lot of definitions about the different factors for metaphysical poetry and the different literary devices that are used in it. And I think that if you include that in your notes and have that to look at while you're answering the focus on language questions, you'll have an easier time with it. Of course, like I said, if you're still having a difficult time, please make sure that you contact me or Ms. Kathy Vahovic. If you're a step-up student, you can contact your advocate and they'll get a hold of us. You can contact your mentor too if you're an MVA student. But that's about it for this lesson. The next lesson is not as long as this one. So there is at least that. Okay, but that's it for me. There's nothing more to say about this lesson. So this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.